A new strategy from the Defense Department outlines how the agency plans to sync up its interests with that of the commercial space companies it works with. The first of its kind 2024 Commercial Space Integration Strategy looks to integrate commercial solutions into DoD's national security space architecture. To learn more about it, we welcome one of the authors of the strategy, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Dr. John Plumb. Dr. Plumb, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, thanks very much, Eric, and I appreciate this opportunity.
As do we. So why don't we just kind of start it from the beginning and just lay out from the 40,000-foot view, since we're talking about space, what does this strategy set out to do, and how did it come about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Eric, we are at a time of really fast and critical change in the national security space environment. You can see this everywhere. You can see it in the way space is being used in the battle in Ukraine. You can see it in the way that the commercial space enterprise is really just accelerating. You can watch launches on a almost weekly basis, if not faster. And you can see it in the way that governments around the world are really examining how they can use space for national security. And when the Department of Defense looks at that, we realize that a lot of that innovation and speed is in the U.S. commercial sector. It's a big driver of the U.S. economy, frankly, at this point. And we want to harness that. The Pentagon's not always that great at doing things quickly or being super innovative quickly. And so if we can figure out a way to harness what the commercial companies are doing to be able to close their business case and use that for national security purposes, we absolutely have to do that. We have to get the best use of taxpayer dollars and move as quickly as we could to keep up at this critical time.
Let's get into the strategy itself. I imagine a lot of this is going to fall on you and your office's shoulders, but who's going to be responsible for actually carrying out what this strategy calls for? And on that note, what does it call for in order to accomplish that?
Yeah, so a few pieces there. So one, the way this works is the strategy is published. It basically is the Secretary of Defense providing direction to the entire department, not just the Space Force, not just my office for space policy, but the entire department on how to think about and approach commercial space. And I should just be clear here that commercial sector we're talking about is different than the defense industrial base, right? A lot of our listeners on Federal News Network are going to be thinking about primes, which are part of the defense industrial base. Commercial sector are those companies that are selling things on the commercial market that we might be able to use as well. And what we're looking at is setting out, basically telling the department, here are basically 4 priorities that you need to be following and adhering to in order to better integrate commercial space into our solutions. 1, we're going to work to ensure access to commercial solutions across the spectrum of conflict. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, it doesn't really do the Department of Defense that much good to buy a service or a solution that only works in peacetime. It needs to be available in a crisis, and it frankly needs to be available in a wartime conflict. And so if we're going to enter into contracts or other mechanisms with commercial space companies to help the Department of Defense, we have to know that there's going to be available not just in peacetime, but in crisis and conflict. One way to help us do that is our second line of effort here, which is to ensure that we are integrating with these commercial companies and providers prior to a conflict. I would say a legacy way of thinking about this would say, well, maybe we'll just buy some additional satellite communications bandwidth that we would only use in a crisis. Well, that means that when the crisis comes, you don't even know how to flex to use that bandwidth. The operators on the commercial side don't know how to switch over to allow you to use that bandwidth. It's not a great model for today's environment. What we want to do is bring operators and other commercial solutions into our daily operations, work with them then, and even train with them so that they know what they might be needed of in crisis or in conflict. Third, and this is on the Department of Defense, we talk a lot about protect and defend, and how are we going to make sure that if we're entering into relationships with commercial companies, that they can be de-risked. And we've got always, of course, in the Department of Defense, the option to use military force, but that's certainly not our primary means or going to be a primary line of effort for protecting and defending commercial systems. We've broken that out into 3 basic things. 1, the entire U.S. government works on creating norms of responsible behavior in space to try to make space a stable and safe domain for anyone to operate in. 2, as we find intelligence about threats to space systems, we need mechanisms to share that information, even if it's classified, with these commercial companies. And 3, there are forms of financial protection available in the air domain and in the sea domain, and the department is going to be exploring whether those types of things should also be applicable to the space domain. And then the last piece that we're doing to integrate commercial solutions is we will continue to look at ways to find innovative technology and invest in those technologies that might have the potential to support the joint force. And there's a number of tools that the department has to do that.
We're speaking with Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Dr. John Plumb. A lot to process there, but you made it a point to say this is not the defense industrial base. Nowhere else does the government rely more on getting or enacting its strategies and policies from commercial entities than in the space realm. What can you say about how important it has become and that it requires this sort of strategy laid out because of that reliance on the commercial sector?
Well, I think you framed it quite well. I think if I were to just kind of flip what you've said, we would be crazy not to be trying to do this, right? We are very reliant on the commercial sector already, at least for launch. Now, of course, the department buys those launch services, but, SpaceX is a private company. They're a commercial company. They do commercial launches. For example, ULA does commercial launches as well. And so if we are buying launches from commercial services, you can't get to space without launch. So right away, you can see that we're already kind of on the hook. But I think the reason that is so entwined is because the two things are happening at the same time, right? We stood up a Space Force. We've stood up Space Command as a combatant command. We've created my position. We've created as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, and there's a Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition. All four of these things were just created in the last few years under the realization that space is becoming more and more important to national security. It's operational domain just like any other domain like land, sea, and air. These things are happening all at the same time that the commercial space sector is really becoming energized, space is becoming democratized, and so for decades, space was really just the purview of the United States, Russia, China, and large nation states. And now that you have companies that can do these things, perhaps faster, definitely sometimes cheaper, and maybe with more innovation, then it'd be crazy not to take advantage of it. And I think it's the fact that these things are happening at the same time that makes that dependence so much stronger than it is in other domains.
Got it. And was there any consultation with representatives in the commercial sector when coming up with this strategy? Or, as you just mentioned, a lot of those positions were just created over the last few years. So obviously, you all have experience working with the commercial sector already. So did you just rely on your own knowledge that you've acquired so far?
No, that would have been a terrible idea, right? So you have to do a lot of outreach and do a lot of tabletopping and exercises with those partners that are going to be affected by the strategy. So that's both stakeholders across the Department of Defense, but also it's the commercial sector. And I'm really proud of my team. They went out and held information sessions with the commercial sector. They held tabletop exercises with the commercial sector and tried to figure out what of those pieces of the commercial space sector would be interested in, right? It isn't just a one-way street. If we're going to enter these type of relationships, both sides need to have some gain there. So I think we did a really good job of level setting with many different companies of different sizes and have really kind of been out there talking to people about it for over the past year while we've been writing this. Writing a big document like this for the first time is a lot of work, and you have to make sure it's socialized both across and up and down your chain of command and others to make sure that everyone is on board. Because if folks aren't on board, then you can write a policy and it'll just fall with the thud. You got to get folks energized and understand that this is important and agree, so that by the time the secretary signs it, they understand this is the direction we're headed. And I think we've done that.
And let's discuss on how this strategy fits overall into DoD's national security goals. As we've already belabored the point about reliance on the commercial sector, at the end of the day, they are a company, so they have to make money. How do you make sure that, your goals don't counteract with a commercial company that's saying, hey, we may have to sell to some near-peer adversaries just to stay afloat?
Okay, let me just break that into a couple pieces. So, first of all, we do have to have access to commercial companies if we're going to enter into these contracts, and we think the easiest way at the moment to do that, or the most sure way to do that, is just to enter in a contract that both parties agree to. If the government's a smart buyer, we can structure contracts in a way to make sure things will be available in crisis and conflict. And I will also say that it is a very routine for contracts to also be structured so that if a company is sold or goes out of business, the U.S. National security piece is protected and the DoD continues to have access to that. There's no case where that would be sold to a potential adversary, of course. But it might be sold to a partner or allied country. And in those cases, when there's a national security component, there are special boards set up to oversee the protection of that national security aspect. So there's a lot of mechanisms already in place, and this is one of the things that was really interesting when we started this strategy. I don't think there was a good baseline of knowledge both in the department or in the commercial sector as to how these